Today I want to talk a little more generally about Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian poetry. In formulating my ideas for these two talks, there was a little bit of a consternation in my mind. How do I go about this? What should I talk to you about? I could give you Ukrainian Literature 101 in 50 minutes. That's a terrible talk. You don't want to listen to that, right? And even that, you just can't do it in 50 minutes. Or I could focus exclusively on the art songs that are part of this year's Summer Institute. And so I decided to do both. That is, today I will give you the history of Ukrainian literature in 50 minutes, more or less, with a focus on how art songs are related to that, and music in general, because I want to say a few words about Ukrainian poetry and music. And tomorrow, I will talk more specifically about the poetry we are looking at in this Summer's Institute, and so more along the lines of close reading. In order to talk about Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian poetry in particular, unfortunately, I have discovered through years of telling undergraduates various things and having blank faces looking at me that you actually have to know a little bit of history in order to understand the first thing about how culture develops. And so let's start there. That is, we begin Ukrainian history with Kievan Rus. Now, that's the map on the screen there is one of the various maps of Kievan Rus. This comes, I should credit him because he did excellent work. This is Professor Maguchi's historical atlas and the map of Kievan Rus. What was Kievan Rus? Kievan Rus was the Hudson's Bay colony. It's the Hudson's Bay Company. The Vikings are not state builders. The Vikings are businessmen. And so the Vikings come to the northern stretch of the Dnipro River, and they set up trading posts. They're good at this, and they set up more than trading posts. They kind of take over the place. But they don't come as colonists. They don't come en masse. That is, the higher end of the feeding chain may be Vikings, but the rest of it are the local Slavic population, the Ukrainians. When the Vikings came, this population was culturally very, very backward. Why? They had no writing. And so the single most important event in the history of Kievan Rus, as far as we are concerned for culture, is Christianization. Christianization comes in 988. It's a political deal. That is, the rulers of Kyiv are getting together with the rulers of Constantinople to come to a political agreement. Otherwise, they're at odds with each other. What happens, however, that is of importance to us is that writing comes to this Slavic territory. There had been the writing scheme that comes was actually developed somewhere else and then abandoned. And so we can start talking about literature, we can start talking about culture from that point onward. That lasts for a while till the Mongol invasion in 1240. Genghis Khan runs his army out of Central Asia, he doesn't get to Kyiv, but his armies do. They burn the city down, and that's the end of Kievan Rus. That is, the state will disappear. Now, naturally, the people are still there. The traditions of the state, whatever culture was there, didn't disappear. I mean, the churches may have been burnt down, but otherwise the culture remains. And so what happens is that the cultural product of these people slowly gets absorbed into a developing Baltic state, Lithuania. Lithuania is even more backward than Rus is at this point. Let's just say they're pagan. Right? So they've got a ways to go. And so the Rus culture, although it has no state representation, is of value to them, and they absorb some of it. Lithuania itself develops, Christianizes, and then joins Poland in something very important called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is a very important state in Central Europe. And Ukrainian territories are part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so there are good opportunities for cultural development. However, the population of the Ukrainian territories is Ukrainian-speaking, or whatever variant of Ukrainian we can ascribe to that time, and they're Orthodox. Population of Poland is Polish-speaking, and they are by and large Catholic. Right? Although there's a large Jewish community, the Jewish presence in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is very important, because when the French kings throw the Jews out, the Polish kings let them in, right? And they stay. In any case, so the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth offers opportunities for development that are largely unrealized until after the middle of the 16th century, 1550s and onward, and it culminates in 1596 in the Union of Brest, which is a religious union that will turn Orthodox Ukrainians into Greek Catholics. That is, it will create what we sometimes call the Uniate Church. It did. The Uniate Church was created. However, in the very last minute, of the various bishops who were supposed to sign this, of which there I think were about 30, only 2 showed up. And so it's a failed treaty, right? And Catholicism does not take root in the Ukrainian population by and large, although it exists. And eventually, the Polish state will force Catholicism on the subservient Ukrainian population. That happens later. In defense of orthodoxy, after, and it's been going on before the Union, there were obviously many reasons to think about defending orthodoxy from the Catholics. After the Union in particular, Orthodox culture really revives. It revives very strongly. And this is the heyday of kind of Ukrainian cultural product in the 17th century, leading up to Bogdan Khmelnytsky. I'll just mention that that cultural product is not in a language that is Ukrainian. That is, it's in Middle Ukrainian, it's in Polish, it's in Latin, it's in all kinds of languages. It's not something we can read today if we can read Ukrainian. But the key event then is Bogdan Khmelnytsky in 1648. Bogdan Khmelnytsky is a Cossack hetman who organizes a revolt against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth has many qualities, one of which is it's an ungovernable state. It's ungovernable because the aristocracy has veto power and elects the king. And so the king is beholden to them. And so without a strong central government, Poland is always subject to all kinds of problems. They will get much more serious 200 years later. But at this point, Khmelnytsky runs a revolution that is almost successful. As a result of this revolution, half of Ukraine breaks off. And we now have a state created by Bogdan Khmelnytsky that is the Cossack state. Socially, the Cossack state is, we're going to throw out the Polish aristocrats, and we are going to take the social structure of the Cossack army and turn that into social aristocracy. Right? And so the country is now run, that is, whatever government terms used to exist, they're now lieutenant and colonel, because that's who is the local administrator. So a colonel is the governor of a territory. And Cossacks, we need to remember, are of 2 different kinds. There are these Cossacks who are part of the Cossack state, These are settled people. They are government. They are aristocracy all but. That is, no king anointed them, so they're not formally aristocrats, but they behave like aristocrats, and they've taken over the wealth and the position of Polish aristocrats. There are also other Cossacks, the Zaporizhian Cossacks, the ones of our imagination, the warriors. They're wild and crazy. They really are wild and crazy. They are very often opposed to the Cossack state because who are you to tell me what to do, right? And they continue to be an important force militarily and sometimes socially. That is, they're a powerful group. In order to succeed, Khmelnytsky had to do something terrible. He had to sign a treaty with the Russian Tsar. The revolt went very well up to a certain point, and at that point things started going badly. He needed some help. And as Khmelnytsky had done throughout his political career, he negotiated a treaty with some neighbor who didn't like Poland. And you give us some help. The Russian Tsar interpreted this treaty differently than Khmelnytsky did. He took it as a treaty of subservience. That is, that the Cossack state pledges loyalty to the Russian Tsardom. That obviously will become a problem. What we have after Khmelnytsky, historically, is the existence of a Cossack state that is being gradually run down in very many ways. It's being run down by constant wars, because the territory it controls is only part of Ukraine. The other part of Ukraine, right bank Ukraine, is in Polish hands. There are other Cossack hetmans there. They're always fighting among each other. So it's a period of slow decline. It's also a period of Russian expansion. That is, the Russian expansion really takes a head of steam in the next century, but it starts here after Khmelnytsky. Russia historically has always been interested in the south. That is, it's not Ukrainian territory they were trying to conquer then. They didn't think of this as Ukrainian territory. Their enemies were the Ottoman Turks, right? So they need to reach the Black Sea and hopefully command the Black Sea. At the same time, Poland is doing worse and worse, especially through the whole 18th century. Poland will gradually disappear, not without some Russian machinations on the side, but there are three countries involved in the disappearance of Poland at the end of the 18th century: Germany, Austria, and Russia. Order a pizza and cut it up. The pizza is Poland, and they eat most of it on the first round, but then they have a little bit left over. So there are two more rounds of cutting the pizza slices. And eventually, there is no Poland left. There are only these slices that have been taken by the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Prussians. In many ways, this is fortunate for Ukraine, because some small section of Ukraine will be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a very different place than the Russian Empire. Okay. What needs particular emphasis here is social disparities. That is, what Khmelnytsky ran a revolution on is a combination of religion, nationality, and social class. All three. That is, Khmelnytsky is running an army of Ukrainian Orthodox lower class people against Catholic Polish aristocracy. The same thing will translate into Russia over time. That is, we will have a Ukrainian lower class population fighting off the incursions of a Russian upper class population. Both are Orthodox on that score. Eventually, under increasing Russian pressure, Ukrainian culture, to a considerable degree, disappears from the visible surface of culture. One of the best examples of that is printing religious books. Peter the Great made an ukaz that no religious text can be printed without approval of the Synod in St. Petersburg. So the major publishing house, the Caves Monastery, which had the most important publishing house, disappears. They can't publish books because they need approval from there, and the business interests up there make sure they never get approval. We'll print that. We'll make the money. So culture goes underground. In the 19th century, we've gotten to the point where the larger part of Ukraine, the much larger part, because now they've taken away the Ukrainian lands that were part of Austria-Hungary, all but one section, Galicia. The Russian Empire is thriving. It's a place where power is growing. Their influence in the south is growing. Eventually, they will have to be beaten back by the British and French in Crimea because the British and French are scared of how powerful the Russians are getting vis-a-vis the Ottomans, who are getting weaker. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is also thriving, but the comparison of the two is very revealing. Russia is a very backward, repressive state. Austria-Hungary, through the 19th century, changes. It acquires a little bit of democracy, not a whole lot, but that is this is a constitutional monarchy. There's a parliament in Vienna. The way of doing things in Austria-Hungary is very different. And that's to great benefit of Ukrainian culture. That is, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there is no reason to repress Ukrainian culture. Who cares? We're German-speaking Austrians, right? The Polish-speaking Poles in this area are the dominant group. If anything, the Ukrainians should be supported because if the Poles get too uppity, they will challenge our Austrian rule. So we should never take steps to diminish that small force of Ukrainian culture. In fact, why don't we help them along? Because they will keep the Poles in check. So in Austria-Hungary, in Western Ukraine, in Galicia, the status of Ukrainian culture is poor, but it's not repressed. Now, if you want to be a socialist, if you want to translate Karl Marx into Ukrainian, well, that will be repressed. The Austrians don't allow that. But any kind of poetry you want to write some novels about the Hutsuls, that's fine. No one worries about that. The language is not a problem. Russia's a different place. Russia represses things Ukrainian. By the end of the 19th century, following a long chain of romantic revival and national awakening, not just among Ukrainians, Poles in the Russian Empire every 30 years there's a Polish revolt, and the Russians have to put it down with armies, right? They see the Ukrainian question, or they pretend to see the Ukrainian question, as part of this Polish problem. They're spurring these Ukrainians to be Ukrainian, right? And as we all know, there is no such thing as a Ukrainian. There's no Ukrainian language, there's nothing, they're just little Russians. And they speak bad Russian, i.e. Ukrainian, because they never learned it properly. And of course, we don't want them to learn it properly. We're never going to bring schools to them. That's the history of Russian-Ukrainian relations in a nutshell in the 19th century, which leads, of course, to revolutionary movements. Serfdom exists in Austria-Hungary up to 1848. It exists in Russia up to 1861. Serfdom in the Austro-Hungarian Empire is a contractual obligation. Serfdom in Russia is slavery. A Russian serf owner can sell his serfs. He can rape them, he can do anything he wants. There are some laws, but who cares? Right? In Austria-Hungary, serfs owe contractual labor obligations to their masters, but it's a very different world. That is, the social disparities are real, but of a different kind. And so left bank Ukraine and Russian Ukraine are fairly unpleasant places to be. Modern Ukraine, and that's where most of our literature will be from, the 20th century in Ukraine is characterized by one disaster after another. There's a strong national revival, a very powerful national revival before World War I. World War I is fought to an enormous degree in Western Ukrainian territory. And then come the revolutionary wars, the Soviet revolutionary wars, which were also fought largely in Ukraine, which result in a Bolshevik state, which for the decade of the 1920s saw culture revive. Ukrainian culture did very well in the 1920s, under certain restrictions, political restrictions. That is, don't write anti-Bolshevik tracts. It's a bad idea. But almost everything else in literature was thriving. Lots of very, very good poetry. Right? But then comes Stalinism. Stalinism crushes all manifestations of things Ukrainian. World War II, which is fought on Ukrainian territory, and millions of Ukrainians die. And many leave at the end. And so at the end of World War II, there had been Ukrainians in Canada and the United States and elsewhere since the late 19th century. But it's after World War II that you get a very nationally conscious wave of immigrants coming. And we call them DPs, because the UN term for them, displaced persons, became their nom de plume. They were all DPs. On the Polish side, Poland exists as a state between World War I and World War II. It did not exist until World War I, and after World War II, it becomes something different. But there was an independent nationalist Polish state moving rightward, moving towards a kind of fascist ideology slowly, that was also repressive of things Ukrainian, but not quite as repressive as Stalin was. There too, the 1920s and early 30s saw a boom in cultural product. And finally, everything ends in this story in 1991 with independence, and from then on, we've got something very different. And so just to quickly summarize some of the things I want to get across, stateless country. I'd like to emphasize this phrase. Ukraine was, for most of its history, either the easternmost piece of Western Europe or the westernmost piece of Eastern Europe. And it continues to play that role today. I belong to that generation where we were taught math with Venn diagrams. And if you remember what a Venn diagram is, those two big circles, and the one in the middle is Ukraine. Okay? It's a good way to understand why Ukrainian culture is peculiar, because it looks both ways. You can see on the board some of the other takeaways. Let's turn to literature. Kievan Rus is of no interest to us. Kievan Rus is a country that has just adopted a writing system from Byzantium. They're learning how to write, they're learning how to do this, they do marvelous things. They don't write poetry. Everything except for historical chronicles is religious, right? And so it exists, but it's not particularly significant to what we want. The period I talked about after the Union of Brest sees an outpouring of polemical literature. Polemical because we need to establish why we, Ruthenian, Ukrainian, Belarusian Orthodox, are as worthy culturally as are the Catholic Poles. Right? It's a tough question and it's very important. Ukraine adopted Orthodoxy Christianity from Byzantium. Byzantium has by now disappeared. It adopted Christianity in its own language. Western Europe used Latin. And as long as every Christian intellectual studied in the same language, all of Western Europe was one intellectual community, to which the Eastern Orthodox Ukrainians don't really have access. Not that they can't learn Latin, they did. The intellectuals did. But it's not the same thing as every priest needs to learn Latin. Right? Ukrainian culture is also multilingual, I mentioned this. A great deal of the literature in the 16th, 17th centuries is written in Polish, is written in Church Slavonic, which is a dead language by then, Chancery Ukrainian. There are all kinds of things going on. And for the most part, there's little poetry, except for folklore. Right? From as far back as the Khmelnytsky days, we have records of folklore. And folklore becomes very, very important because folklore will be the basis for much of what happens later. The folklore is simple folk songs, also an epic genre called dume. Dume are recitative, that is, these are professional singers of tales who go out into the public and tell historical stories, mostly about Cossacks. Right? They become the basis for a cultural leap in the 19th century. There's one particularly important figure at the end of the 18th century. His name is Grigory Skovoroda. And he needs to be here because he's one of you. That is, he served as a choir boy in the imperial choir for a number of years. That is, he went to Petersburg and he was a singer. Right? But he was highly educated and a dropout. That is, this is a man, when I talked about underground culture, Skovoroda exemplifies this to a T. Skovoroda published nothing in his own lifetime. Skovoroda walked the back roads, talked to people, wrote his treatises, right? And spent a lot of time at the estate of one of his friends, a rich nobleman who owned a lot of land. And that's where his museum was, and the picture in the bottom right there is about a month and a half ago, the Russians bombed that place. Not because it had great strategic value. Skovoroda is a very dead letter by now. But he was a very important figure, and he wrote poetry as well. And his poetry was set to music in the 19th century and influenced other writers. Next person I want to talk about, also musically related, is the man often called the father of Ukrainian literature, because he was the first person, people had been writing in Ukrainian. Skovoroda wrote in a language that isn't quite Ukrainian, but it's close to Ukrainian. Ivan Kotlяревский was a curious man because he was well educated and he didn't have a high social position and worked mostly as a tutor in the families of rich people. And so the schooling eventually got to him. And of course, you know, the school curriculum everywhere includes all the greats of classical literature. And what Kotlяревский did obviously comes out of his kind of education days, his days at the university, where everybody had to learn Virgil by heart, and whatever. And he travestied it. That is, he produced a work that is Virgil's Aeneid, but Virgil is a Cossack hetman. The troops are Cossacks, and the things they do are all Ukrainian. And so you have these wonderful passages of, you know, and then they sat down and ate. Virgil doesn't tell you what everybody ate. Kotlяревский does, and it's all Ukrainian food. It's all ethnic food. It's like straight out of a, you know, guidebook for ethnic restaurants. What's interesting about him is putting the Aeneid, one of the most important works of world literature, into Ukrainian is a deliberate attempt at a joke. That is, it's not in Latin, it's in this language that no educated person speaks, right? That is, who can read this? In fact, he didn't publish the work originally himself. It was published by a fellow who stole it from him, that had the manuscript, didn't ask permission, and published it. And the people who liked it were like rich Ukrainians in St. Petersburg who kind of get the joke, right? Russians can follow it, but it wasn't really for them. In any case, Tarnawsky worked in the theater, and he wrote what we would call musicals. One of the most famous of those is called Natalka Poltavka, and Lysenko turned it into an opera. Then we've got the 19th century. The 19th century begins with Romanticism with a capital R. Romanticism of a German mold. The German Romantic mold is based on the folk, right? Everything is about the people. Now, the people isn't, we're not in the United States here, we the people. No, the people is the bums who work in our houses. We're not people, we're super people. We're the aristocracy, right? So that version of the people is what Romantic thinking is like in the early 19th century. We need to pick up, Voltaire has famous quotes about, North American Indians in old translation, indigenous people, right? And how wonderful their culture is, as opposed to completely uncivilized France, right? Where, you don't want that kind of culture. You want the culture of the indigenous people of North America, because they're real culture, right? That's what Romanticism is. That is, this idea that the culture of the ordinary person is what is valuable, and all this sophisticated, Virgil isn't important. And so we get a variety of people, very often tied to universities, because this is an idea that is being taught at universities. German philologists come to teach at the newly established Kharkiv University, and they push these ideas. And where better to find the folk than in Ukraine? Go out and collect folklore. And they do, massively. That is, massive collections of folklore were assembled in the first half of the 19th century. And then they weren't really always very honest about this, because, I heard a song, it was something like this, but I don't remember exactly. So I kind of filled in the details. And you get to the point where folklore is not only something that you collect and it's authentic, you write it yourself, right? And then you publish it with your name on the title page of the book. So it's obviously not folklore anymore, it's your poetry, because folklore is defined by not having an author, right? But it works that way. That is, the Romantic revival in the 19th century meant that writing things that sound like folklore is popular. And I've got a couple of people that is, as I recall, I don't know the entire set of the repertoire in the Art Song Project. I don't think any of these three are there. But these are imitators of folklore. And we will see this kind of writing all the way up to the end of the 20th century, with a little bit more sophistication, maybe a little more subtlety. But that's much of Ukrainian poetry is based on folklore, until we get to Taras Shevchenko. I will have opportunity to talk more about Taras Shevchenko tomorrow, because we're dealing with some of his poems. Taras Shevchenko is a revolution in one person. The first important thing you need to know is he's not a human being. He's born a serf. He isn't free. He is, in fact, a cow. But he's a very talented cow. in two ways, mostly as a painter, right? He's a highly skilled painter, and eventually, do-goodnik society in Petersburg, the Society for Protection of Young Artists, organizes a campaign to buy his freedom. And they do. They buy his freedom, manumission, and they give him a scholarship to the Academy of Arts in Petersburg. Now, Academy of Arts is not quite the same thing as a university, but it's a pretty damn good school. That is, it's a great art school. That is, this is a place where you will learn all the techniques of art that you can imagine. But because there's a lot of history involved in art at the time, that is, historical painting is still very strong, he actually has a very good education. He's very widely read, self-taught mostly, but he's also a poet. He becomes the figure in Ukrainian literature. That is, every Ukrainian in the world admires Shevchenko. Even the 13-year-olds in school who hate him because they're forced to memorize his poems in class by these crazy school marms who think that that's what you're supposed to do in school, is teach people to recite Shevchenko. That happens in our schools too. But he is such a brilliant poet, and he is the symbol of Ukrainian national aspiration, because he is a poet whose work channels two basic ideas: nationality and social class. I'm for Ukraine, and I'm for the people. And of course he's for the people. He's a former serf. He spends most of his adult life hobnobbing with some of the most cultured people in the Russian Empire. But he's not happy there. He's a serf. He's a former serf. And of course, the national question for him is just, that's who I am. And his poetry, he's just a better poet than everybody else in the 19th century. And he's a different kind of romantic poet. That is, when I teach, I've got a little set piece, a couple lectures on Mickiewicz, Pushkin, and Shevchenko. Mickiewicz, the great Polish romantic, Pushkin, the great Russian romantic. He's very different. Pushkin is a highbrow poet, hanging around with the aristocracy and writing about the Tsar and, monuments to Peter the Great. Mickiewicz is a dyed-in-the-wool revolutionary. He's trying to overturn things, right? Although he's also an aristocrat. Shevchenko writes about himself. He's a lyric poet who projects the idea of himself into the image of the quintessential Ukrainian. Right? He wasn't the person in his poetry. That is a projection. We know for a fact, we know a great deal of his biography. We know for a fact, the day he wrote this little, here I am, bedraggled, he put on a tuxedo and went out to the ball, with the aristocracy. But that's Shevchenko. Lots of art songs on his works. Pantelimon Kulish, another figure, I'm not sure that there are songs in the repertoire from Panko Kulish. He's a friend of Shevchenko, and a figure that's important. He's also a poet, and his early poetry is very romantic. It's like those early romantics we were looking at in the slide before Shevchenko. He's a good poet, not quite Shevchenko. And in his later years, he adopts a very different approach to things. In his early poetry, it's folkloric, it's Cossack-related, rah-rah, the Ukrainian Cossacks. Late in his life, because he was also a historian, a publisher, he was Shevchenko's publisher for a while, he changed his thinking about the value of the folk. That is, about the value of the folk, about the value of the Cossacks. His value system changed to the point where what he wanted most for Ukraine was high culture. That is, what we need is to get out of the mire of Cossack dancing and, and sunflowers. There is a Ukrainian culture that isn't just pierogies. That's Panko Kulish. That is, Kulish is the translator of the Bible into Ukrainian. He translated Shakespeare into Ukrainian. He translated a great many other things in Ukrainian. And his later poetry doesn't read like Romanticism anymore, right? And in that sense, he's an important figure. But like I say, I'm not sure we have songs on his texts. Ivan Franko, there's a triad of great Ukrainian writers, Shevchenko, Franko, and Lesya Ukrainka, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost. There has to be three, and this complete invention, but so be it. Ivan Franko, of whom there are a great many songs in the art song repertoire, is an interesting figure because he's mostly a politician. That is, he spends his entire life agitating for socialist ideas. He is in Western Ukraine, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? That is, he's not fighting off Russian repression. At the time he's writing, Ukrainian language is actually prohibited in Ukraine, in Great Ukraine, that is, in the Russian Empire. It's illegal to publish books in Ukrainian. As I said, in Austria, that's never the case, unless you start channeling Marx, which Franko did a little bit too much of, right? And so he ended up in jail. He got arrested 3 times, right? I mean, he had his troubles. But he is, the word everyone associates with him is Kulturträger. That is, he is a man who will personally create Ukrainian culture in the late 19th century in Western Ukraine. He has absolutely beautiful lyric poetry, 1 volume of that about himself. A lot of his poetry is soapbox poetry. That is, the Ukrainian nation must rise. He translated the International into Ukrainian, right? He wrote all kinds of patriotic verse. He's probably best known for an image of the stone cutter. That is, we, the toiling masses, work for the betterment of mankind, and we chop the cliff to make the road. That's Franko. He probably wrote a whole lot more prose than poetry. He certainly wrote more journalism. That is, his works are 56 volumes, right? And that's not complete, right? He's a very important figure and very influential in all of Ukraine, but particularly Western Ukraine. The other person in the triad is Lesya Ukrainka, Larissa Kosach. People don't have names like Lesya Ukrainka. Ukrainka, that is, Ukrainian publishing is prohibited in the Russian Empire. So people like Lesya are sending their works, actually it was her mom, are sending her works. Her mom was the tennis mom of the all-time great tennis mom of poetry, right? So she's sending her 13-year-old daughter's works to get published in Lviv, in Western Ukraine, in Austria-Hungary, where it's perfectly legal. And everybody uses a pseudonym for various reasons. I mean, what you do is more or less illegal where you live, right? So what kind of pseudonym does she use? Well, the word Ukrainka in Western Ukraine always means from over there. Because when you ask them what they are, they all said "Me Ruski," right? Because their ethnonym needs to distinguish them from Poles, from Austrians, but they keep the old word. Rus and Ruski is the old word for all of these Slavic people in the East. So Lesya Ukrainka is the Lesya. That's not her name. Her name is Larissa. Lesya is a pet name at home for a little girl. That's Lesya Ukrainka. We will return to talk about her next time because we will deal with some of her poetry. Poor health is very important. She has tuberculosis. In the early 20th century in Western Ukraine, we have a large group of modernist writers. Molda Muza is a group of them. We've got a couple of their names here. These people appear in the Art Song Project. Their works do. What is interesting about these modernists is the switch to modernism somewhat follows what I said Kulish had been doing. We want high culture. We want influences from Western Europe. But in fact, these poets, they drop folklore. That is, their poetry is no longer folklore inspired. But they still write about, half the time it's love songs, half the time it's about, the colors, they're so beautiful, the birds, the bee, whatever. But then they still talk about national issues, right? Which used to be the bugaboo. That is, that used to be the dividing line. You talked about the 19th century romantics. In the late 19th century, they were all concentrating on the national question, on the social question. The modernists should have been dropping that, but they only partially drop it. They still return to it. And so all of these people, Pachowski, Karmansky, Alexander Olesh, we'll talk about him next time, he's in Russia, that is, he's not in the West. They all still write a fair dose of patriotic verse, and some of that occurs in the art songs. Soviet Ukrainian poetry in the 20s, I told you the 20s was a time of great revival, a massive outpouring of fantastic poetry, absolutely fantastic poetry. Very little art songs will be written on these texts, very few will appear, because these people write a kind of poetry that is either overly intellectual or, in the case of someone like Bajan writes almost grotesque images in his poetry. So these people, they are the heart and soul of Ukrainian poetry in the 1920s, but they're not really what's going to appear in the art songs. The most important person in this constellation is a poet whose name is Pawlo Tyczyna. As far as I know, he's not in the Art Song Project, but maybe he could be. Because not only is he the best Ukrainian poet of the 20th century, he is a poet, only Shevchenko comes close in his mastery of words and images. Tyczyna can create images. He can use language in a way that just bowls everybody over. And unfortunately, that is in a world like ours, where that is many of you don't speak Ukrainian, that is you sing the text, but you can't really appreciate it as poetry. Tyczyna would blow your mind away. He is really a superior poet. And there have been, I have it lined up, but I've taken too much time, so I won't play it. I remember a song written to one of his texts that I listened to in childhood. My father used to like to sing it, and it's just brilliant. That is, that poem is brilliant, but you can use it as a lullaby for children because they don't have to understand the images, right? Galician interwar poetry, that is, Poland exists as a state between World War I and World War II. There is a great deal of Ukrainian literature being written there. A great deal of it is revolutionary anti-Polish stuff, right, for good reason. But there are a couple of groups, the Catholic group, for example, there's a group of late modernists producing really good poetry, and this does occur in the Art Song Project, that is poetry from this period, from these authors. The most important of these authors, not aligned with any of these groups, was Bohdan Ihor Antonich, a very interesting poet with very complicated kind of philosophical imagery. I just throw him in there in case he ever appears in the Art Song Project. And then, of course, there is post-war diaspora poetry. That is, because there's a volume of Galicians, because there's a volume of Turkevich, that is, poets who lived in the West. The woman on the bottom right there is Vera Vok, Vera Selyanska. The woman on the top right is Emma Andiewska. I mean, these were important poets Emma lived in Munich most of her life. Vera Volk, Emma's still alive. And Vera Volk, who died 2 months ago, 3 months ago, lived in Buenos Aires, right? These were interesting writers from the diaspora, and because people like Turkevich are in the diaspora themselves, they're writing music to the words of poets they know. I'm going to stop here. I've already gone long.